Buenas noches. Good evening, everyone. Mi nombre es Alejandra Marroquín. Sirvo en el comité de la directiva de la iniciativa de la Universidad de Scranton que se llama Historia de Scranton, Historia de Nuestra Nación. Y es un placer para nosotros darle la bienvenida esta noche a Caminemos con Jesús, la encarnación de la teología latina en canción con Tony Alonso, el primer evento en nuestro tema número 7, que es el tapiz religioso de Scranton. Hay patrocinadores para este evento, que es la Universidad de Scranton, the Scranton Ministerium, el Comité de Inclusión de Inmigración del Condado de Lackawanna y, por supuesto, the National Endowment for the Humanities, quien apoya este proyecto. Este tema celebra la diversidad de nuestras tradiciones religiosas en Scranton, especialmente en nuestros diferentes vecindarios y en todas las religiones, y nos invita a considerar el papel que tiene la migración, la tradición y el cambio. Estos grupos religiosos siempre han servido como un recurso y una comunidad para los recién llegados, desde los inmigrantes irlandeses, polacos, alemanes, galeses, italianos y otros europeos de la era minera del carbón hasta los inmigrantes más recientes que vienen de varios países de América Latina y traen nueva vitalidad a la Iglesia Católica y una nueva forma de practicar nuestra fe, así como otras denominaciones cristianas de Scranton. De hecho, Scranton también está volviéndose mucho más vibrante debido al crecimiento de las comunidades latinas, que ahora representan alrededor del 15% de la población. Esta noche tendremos la oportunidad de reflexionar específicamente sobre las contribuciones de los latinos en teología, cultura y canto a través de una reflexión, teología y música ofrecida por nuestro invitado, Tony Alonso. Después de la presentación vamos a tener una oportunidad de hacer preguntas. Y la doctora Michelle Maldonado, que es la rectora y vicepresidente de Asuntos Académicos de la Universidad de Scranton, va a ser quien va a presentar a Tony. So this was a test to see how much Spanish you know. So let's see, I hope you passed. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alejandra Marroquin. I serve on the steering committee of the Scranton Story, Our Nation Story. The Scranton Story, Our Nation Story, which is an initiative, and it's our pleasure to welcome you tonight to Caminemos con Jesús, Incarnating the Hispanic Latinx Theology in Song with Tony Alonso. The first event on our 7th theme, the religious tapestry of Scranton, past and present. I want to especially thank our partners at the University of Scranton, the Scranton Area Ministerium, the Lackawanna County Immigration Inclusion Committee, and of course, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which supports this project. This theme celebrates the diversity of our religious traditions in Scranton, especially in our different neighborhoods, and across multi-faiths, and invites us to consider the role of immigration, tradition, and change. These faith groups have always served as a resource and community for newcomers, from the Irish, Polish, German, Welsh, Italian, and other European immigrants of the coal mining era to the more recent immigrants coming from across Latin America and bringing a new vitality to the Catholic Church in a new way of practicing faith, as well as other Christian denominations in Scranton. Indeed, Scranton is also becoming that much vibrant because of the growth of the Hispanic Latinx communities, which now make up about 50% of our population. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to reflect specifically on the contributions of the Hispanic Latinx in theology, culture, song, through a theological and musical reflection offered by our guest, Latin Grammy-nominated composer and scholar, Dr. Tony Alonso. After he speaks and shares his music, we will have a chance for a Q&A discussion. I forgot. There is this part of the 7th theme. Part of the 7th theme of the religious tapestry is going to be a bus tour that is going to be on Sunday, May 7th, and Saturday, May 13th. And this bus is going to go to the different places of worship, which are Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish. And so there's a flyer on the back on your way out. You can grab one. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Maldonado, the University of Scranton Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, who will introduce Dr. Tony Alonso. Dr. Maldonado.
We're the same height, but she has heels on tonight, so I have to lower it a little bit. Good evening, buenas noches. I am thrilled to be introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Tony Alonso, this evening. Dr. Alonso is a Latin Grammy-nominated composer of sacred music and a scholar whose work responds to the diverse realities of contemporary culture. A Cuban-American Roman Catholic, Dr. Alonso's compositions embrace multicultural musical expressions and reflect a commitment to strong ritual song. His music appears in compilations and hymnals across Christian denominations throughout the world. His Mass of Joy and Peace is one of the most widely sung Mass settings in the English-speaking world. In 2015, Dr. Alonso's compositional work was recognized with an invitation to compose the responsorial psalm for the first Mass Pope Francis celebrated in the United States. I know. I know my mom must have been very proud. In 2020, he was nominated for a Latin Grammy for his groundbreaking album, Caminemos con Jesús. Dr. Alonso's scholarly work lies at the intersection of liturgical theology and cultural studies. In 2019, he was awarded the Catherine Maury Lacuna Award for New Scholars for the best academic essay in the field of theology within the Roman Catholic tradition by the Catholic Theological Society of America. His book, which is fantastic, Commodified Communion, Eucharist, Consumer Culture, and the Practice of Everyday Life, was awarded the 2021 Hispanic Theological Initiative Book Prize, an award that recognizes the best book written by junior Latinx scholars in theology or religion each year. Dr. Alonso holds a Bachelor of Music in Choral Conducting from Northwestern University, a Master of Arts in Theology from Loyola Marymount University, and a PhD in Religion from Emory University. He is currently Aquinas Assistant Professor of Theology and Culture at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where he also serves as their inaugural Director of Catholic Studies. As someone who has known Tony for several years, I can enthusiastically say that we are in for a wonderful evening. Tony, it is a privilege to have you with us tonight. Your music and your theological writings are a gift to us, and I want to thank you for your work. Bienvenido a la Universidad de Scranton, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Tony Alonso.
Wow, thank you. My mom would have liked that introduction.
I can give it to you.
Yeah. My dad, too. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, Provost Gonzalez. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for everyone who has been so hospitable in welcoming me into your midst today. And especially thanks to all of you gathered here on, is it a Wednesday night? Yeah, I know what it is like to give up a Wednesday night to come out for something, and I am grateful that we are together here this evening. It's such a delight to be here in Scranton for the very first time, and there's kind of a full circle moment for me when I walked into the chapel today and I realized that I was going to be in Madonna della Strada Chapel, because I remembered that the first time that I met your esteemed provost, I was just a wee child, 21 years old in Chicago, playing for a little liturgy in a different Madonna della Strada Chapel in Loyola, Chicago. And the guest speaker was Michelle, I think Maldonado at the time maybe, Michelle Gonzalez. And I don't know if we met that night or not, I really can't remember, but I remember all these years later because it was the first time that I had heard a Latina theologian speak in a prominent position, and it was very meaningful to me. And then to find out that you were Cuban was like incredible for me. So here we are, 20 years plus later at a different Madonna della Strada Chapel on the other side of the country. She's a provost, and I'm here at her invitation. And I really wouldn't have thought that a reunion of two Cuban Americans would happen in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but here we are. So talk about the slow and often surprising work of God. So this is a different kind of talk for me. Whenever people ask me to speak somewhere, I usually say, do you want musical Tony or do you want academic theologian Tony? In fact, I have two pictures that go along with those that I offer for the posters as well. But one of the things that made me happy about tonight's invitation is that Michelle asked me for a little bit of both. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to bring the fullness of who I am into this space tonight. Because of course, being an academic, theologian, being a musician are not actually separate realities for me personally. My theology is deeply informed by my experiences as a pastoral musician and as a composer. And I think I do my deepest theologizing through my music, even if it doesn't count for tenure and promotion at my institution. In fact, I hope, as you'll see this evening, that music and theology are finally inseparable for me. And the music I write is itself an expression of a lived theology distinct from, but continuous with other kinds of more textual forms of theologizing. So tonight I'm going to use this album, Caminemos con Jesus, recording in a decidedly Cuban style that came out in 2020, if you can believe it. So I haven't had a ton of opportunities to share a lot about it because it happened and then the world shut down 3 months later. But I want to use that project as the source of my reflection this evening. And I want to begin by offering a brief history of the project and hopefully in so doing convey a little bit about myself for you since my own history is so deeply embedded in the project. And then I want to offer some reflection on two particular works of Latino theology that have been particularly meaningful for me in laying a foundation both in my scholarly work and in this project. But we're also going to do a little singing along the way. And so I want to start with a song. And so you have a little handout, hopefully, that you got as you walked in. If you don't raise your hand, I'm sure someone will bring you one. And we're going to start with this song called Qué alegría cuando me dijeron. And as I'm going to talk a bit about throughout this lecture, is that most of this music cannot be done alone. Like most Cuban music, it has to be done together. And so that means you have a very important role in this music because I can't sing the whole song for you. And so this first song, first of all, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, let me just say the words for you. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. I rejoiced when I heard them say, let us go to the house of the Lord. And it sounds like this. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Try that. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Good, listen to it one more time. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Try it again. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. That's the refrain. And then when the verse comes around, I'm going to sing little things, and you're just going to sing, vamos a la casa del Señor. Try that. Vamos a la casa del Señor. That happens 4 times in the verses. You might want to move something if you feel so moved. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Vengan los que tienen sed, vamos, vamos a la casa del Señor. Vengan a las aguas. Y los que no tienen dinero, beben y coman sin deuda. Vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron, vamos a la casa del Señor. you tired and weary, vamos, vamos a la casa del Señor. And the Lord will give you rest. For his yoke is easy, and his burden is light. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Vengan a tomar del agua viva. Vamos a la casa. Vengan a ver la luz del mundo. Vengan y sigan al buen pastor. El camino, la verdad y la vida. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Come all you who hunger, come to the feast. For Christ is the bread of life. All who eat will never hunger. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. Qué alegría cuando me dijeron vamos a la casa del Señor. You sound great, and we're just getting warmed up, so. So before I talk about the explicit theological origins of this project, I wanted to share a little bit about the personal and musical origins of it. Caminemos con Jesus is a project that rattled around inside of me for a very long time before it was finally able to come out. In a sense, its deepest roots were planted long before I was born in Cienfuegos, Cuba, the hometown of my grandparents, Antonio and Daisy, and of my father and his siblings. At the time of the Cuban Revolution, my grandfather was forced to flee first to South America, then to Miami, leaving behind his family in Cuba for nearly 2 years before he was finally able to help them escape with the support of course, some Catholic sisters. So, sisters, you always have a place in my heart. Like many Cubans who fled to the United States at that time, they assumed their stay would be short, that the revolution would come to a quick end, and that within a year or two they would soon return home. And like many Cubans at that time, they left behind almost everything to come to almost nothing. And I say almost everything because there is one rather significant thing that they carried over the border, not carried over by many other immigrants, the privilege of education. And while that education in no way lessened the pain of exile from their beloved country or the pain and fear of a 2-year separation, my grandfather's education in particular made paths to survival that allowed his family to finally flourish in the United States despite its many challenges. After finally learning English, and for a well-educated person, it took him a very long time to learn English, like a decade. He moved the family from Miami to, are you ready for it? A small town in Minnesota, where he got a job teaching Spanish at a small Catholic women's college. Needless to say, it was a culture shock for everyone involved when these Cubans traded the Sunshine State for the land of 10,000 lakes, especially for my grandmother, Daisy, whose wet hair froze the first time she stepped outside in a Minnesota winter, and perhaps worst of all, when she couldn't find any black beans or yucca in the local supermarket. So my father's family moved to that small town, Winona, Minnesota, when my father was just entering high school. And it happens to be that that's the same town where my mother was born and raised. And that's where my dad, a newly arrived Cuban-American teenager who had never seen snow, and my mom, a quiet Minnesotan teenager who had never seen a Cuban, met in high school. Not long after high school, they later married and eventually moved back to Florida, where I was born and where we lived till I was 5. Then we moved back to the Midwest, where I was raised a kind of unicorn, a Cuban Minnesotan, or a Cubasotan, if you will. Side note, you know how the Facebook and Instagram give you these like targeted ads? They're really dialing it in, because the other day I saw an ad for a Cuban sandwich casserole, which sounds horrifying, but it is impressive that they're getting that micro-targeting. So there are, of course, many details to fill in about this history. Many stories more appropriate over a cafecito or a casserole, and others over some good rum. But suffice it to say, I've always felt like I've lived between these two primary cultural realities. And because both sides of my family are Catholic, I've always lived between two profoundly different expressions of what that meant in my family, especially for how these two sides of my family experienced God in the practice of their own everyday life. Not one right or wrong, but both always present. As a Cuban American born in Miami but ultimately raised in Minnesota, it might not surprise you to know that there were few opportunities to express the fullness of my Cuban identity in our small Midwestern town in the 1980s and 1990s. And probably like many people who live in between, perhaps like many of you, the opportunities that manifested themselves most frequently to express that part of my identity were food and music, which, by the way, Scripture tells us will both be present in heaven. When we would visit my grandparents in Miami, knowing I loved music from a young age, my grandfather took up the task of passing on Cuban music to me like it was his job, like I was his student and he was my professor. He would take me to a record store on Calle Ocho on A Street in Miami, Casino Records it was called, and with determination and efficiency, he would pull cassettes and later CDs off the shelves, handing them to me like he was assigning me homework. And on the drive home, and in the days that followed our visit to the record store, he would tell me about different artists, different styles, different sounds, and the histories attached to them. It was only clear later to me that this ritual was about more than simply sharing music that he loved with me. It was the central way in which he saw an opportunity to convey his deep love and memory of a homeland to which he finally knew he would never return. Music for him, perhaps for many of you, is the strongest link. So my reaction to this music when I first heard it was visceral. It was like magic to me. It was like nothing I had heard before. When we would return home to Minnesota, one of the most powerful ways I felt connected to him and to my grandmother was to play all the recordings that he bought for me over and over again. And it was the first time that I realized that music can connect us not only to people who are distant from us, but even to places we have never been, to ancestors we have never met. Hearing this music connected me from small-town southern Minnesota to a small island 90 miles south of Florida to which I had never been. So what was this music he was handing on to me? At the heart of the vast majority of the music my grandfather gave me over those years was a genre called the son cubano. Son, a word spelled like the English word sun, and derived from the Spanish word sonar, to sound, is a genre of music that was born in Cuba in the mid to late 19th century. You might not know what it is, but you've heard it before. Son is the foundation of almost all contemporary Cuban music, including salsa and timba. It's folk music born in the mountains and in the countryside of Cuba among the poor and the enslaved. It fuses together lyrical Spanish melodies and complex African rhythms. And here, I promise, is the first and last brief musical lesson of the day. So at the heart of the son, instrumentally, is what's called a montuno. Have any of you heard of montuno before? It's that very distinct sound you hear in Cuban music, the piano, right? That's the montuno. That's a fundamental thing. First, it was played on a tres guitar, and then later, as salsa and other styles developed, it often is found in the piano, right? And then there's the tumbao, a rhythmic kind of bass pattern that happens. In most Western popular music, the bass notes fall on the downbeat, right? Like, if you're a bass player, you're used to playing a lot of downbeats. But in Cuban music, it's on the offbeat. I find it very hard to play both because usually the bass player is playing the one and the piano is playing the other. So you have the montuno and you have the tumbao. And then there's a lot of distinctive percussion patterns that I can't show you right now because this would turn into a whole other lecture. But then vocally, there's an estribillo, a chorus, that's sung antiphonally with a group, right, with singers. So there's an improvised part. So the most familiar song that probably most of you in this room have heard before is Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera. Oh, sisters, you know it. Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera. And then the singer improvising. It's Wednesday night in Scranton. It's a Wednesday night. And we're here with the sisters on a Wednesday night. Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera. Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera. And of course you heard all of this in the first song that we sang tonight, right? Come all you tired and weary, vamos a la casa del Señor. Right, that constant back and forth happening. So that's my musical lesson for the day. Yeah, there'll be more, don't worry. So at its foundation, the son, comprised mainly of those elements, was a highly flexible, improvisational, and portable format, requiring little more than maybe a tres guitar, something to tap, maybe even your body or a bottle or a chair or something else, and the voices of a leader and whoever else happened to be around. It's the way that Cubans really told their story to one another. In one of the earliest forms of Guantanamera, in fact, the verses were improvised, offering social commentary on the events of the day, or even telling jokes, offering humor, always interspersed with that same refrain, whether it connected or not with the main message that was being shared. And perhaps because of its portability and improvisatory nature, the son spread throughout Cuba very quickly and easily with new variations and local adaptations. And there's so much that I could say about the son. And for Cubans, it refers not only to a musical genre like I've described here, but even more an attitude, a way of being, really a symbol of Cuban identity. It remains one of the most powerful ways Cubans tell their story to one another on the island and in exile from it. And I might add, even though I made it sound so simple, It's almost like, I don't know if any of you cook Cuban food, but like everything starts with a little sofrito base, right? But you can do so much with it, right? Like it can get so complicated, but always at the heart is that. So despite my deep love of this style for so long, even as I achieved some success as a liturgical composer, I always had a bit of a reluctance to approach it compositionally. It always felt like somehow other to me in a way that I didn't feel like I had the authority to claim. I don't know if any of you have had that experience about your own heritage. It's like there, but somehow distant from you. And I also kind of wondered if this music could function liturgically. And so in many ways, my reflections tonight are about how I got over these challenges. And there are two deeply personal experiences I need to name that contributed more than anything else to my desire not only to pursue this project, but my need to pursue this project. And one was the death of my abuela Daisy. When she died, she was the last remaining anchor to my Cuban identity. And that made me, I mean, other than my dad, but that's different, because he didn't cook any of the recipes. But her loss made me newly aware of the ways I could no longer take for granted certain things that had always been there for me. I soon found myself wanting to internalize all of her recipes. I tried to construct her home altar in my home. And then there was the music, its presence in my life now marked by an absence that connected me to her and my grandfather who had died years earlier in new ways. And the second experience was my first and to date only trip to Cuba in 2017 with my father. Amazingly, today, I saw in my Facebook memories, was the anniversary of that first trip. And the decision to finally take that pilgrimage, I know if any of you know Cuban Americans, it's a very fraught decision, to a place that I felt in my bones, but I had never been, began to invite me to explore this project more deeply. So Caminemos con Jesus is in many ways a response to those two experiences, both of loss and of the possibility of new life. Before I move on to talk about how all of this connects with Latino theology, in honor of the sisters requesting it, I want to keep singing a little bit. So I know that's why you paid the big bucks. This is called Vayan por el mundo entero. And so here again, you'll hear all of the elements of the son. And I was telling someone earlier that I pretty much only sung these songs with a Cuban band behind me, so it's like, wow, I have to actually play this stuff. Fun. So let me teach this to you. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Try that. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Try that again. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Good. If you want to sing a harmony, I'm not going to complain. And then in the verses, like the last piece, the response is very simple. Y prediquen el evangelio. Try that. Y prediquen el evangelio. You got it. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Prediquen buenas nuevas a los pobres y prediquen el evangelio. Venden a los quebrantados y prediquen el evangelio. Proclamen libertad a los cautivos y prediquen el evangelio. Y bendición a los prisioneros y prediquen el evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el evangelio. Go and make disciples. Make disciples of the nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, y prediquen el Evangelio of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, y prediquen el Evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el Evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el Evangelio. Vayan otra vez. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el Evangelio. Vayan por el mundo entero y prediquen el Evangelio. So, if the loss of my grandmother and that first trip my father and I took to Cuba were the more personal reasons that finally led me to pursue this project, it was beginning to encounter particular strands of Latino theology that helped begin to kind of shake loose pieces of my own identity that had long felt fragmented and provide a kind of theological framework for the project. One of the first theological sparks for me was a book given to me by Cecilia González Sanriu by the late Cuban-American theologian Alejandro Garcia Rivera, especially his book, The Community of the Beautiful. And yet here, another full circle moment, since it was Dr. González's mentor and close friend, as many of you might know. So I'm gonna tread lightly on that. I'm a little nervous with you right here. But Garcia Rivera begins his articulation of a pretty dense vision for theological aesthetics in a fairly seemingly simple story born of his own context, a tale of two Christmas trees in a Lutheran church at which he ministered in Allentown. Usually I have to say Pennsylvania, but I don't have to say that tonight. One, the tree of a well-established English-speaking community that worshiped in the main sanctuary of the church downstairs, and the other, the tree of a burgeoning Spanish-speaking community that worshiped upstairs above the main sanctuary in a small auditorium. It sounds like a lot of the changes you were narrating at the beginning tonight. In Garcia Rivera's telling, the English-speaking community had a long custom of putting up a towering natural fir in the main sanctuary of the church, which they decorated with white lights and simple white symbols. Some, from some backgrounds, might say tasteful. The Spanish-speaking community, on the other hand, had recently purchased a 4-foot artificial tree for their small space, which they decorated with flashing multicolored lights, heaps of tinsel, and a rotating light on top. Any reasonable Minnesotan would call it tacky. And around the tree, they had cut out a life-size plywood representation of a nativity scene with a large bright star hanging over the crib that they borrowed from a community in nearby Bethlehem. This time I will add Pennsylvania, which looks exactly like my grandmother's nativity, by the way, this description. So according to Garcia Rivera, when the English-speaking community downstairs saw the Christmas decorations of the Spanish-speaking community upstairs, they said something like, "How tacky." And when the community upstairs saw the decoration of the community downstairs, they exclaimed, "How lifeless." Seemingly small debates like this repeated themselves over and over again during his time as part of the community. And as a result, he writes, the English-speaking leadership of the church ultimately decided that perhaps the Spanish-speaking community might be happier elsewhere. If you can't say amen, say ouch. Like any good story, Garcia Rivera's seemingly simple parable about these two trees contains so much more than we can unfold here tonight. It hints at parts of my own biography and shares traces of my own experiences working in bilingual churches throughout the United States. But even more, it lays bare how a whole world of aesthetic judgments, cultural expectations, and power relationships can be bound up with something as seemingly simple as a Christmas tree. Of course, any of you all who have worked in a church for more than a minute know the monumental significance that such symbols can take on, and how aesthetic debates about worship, whether a song, a worship style, liturgical adornment, can seemingly take on more force than historic debates about central Christian doctrines. There is much I love about this story, for what it discloses about beauty and ethics for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. But among the many things I love is how this story, born of a personal pastoral experience, drives Garcia Rivera's quest for a complex theological aesthetics to make sense of it theologically. He sees in a dominant strand of theological reflection the destructive consequences that convictions about normative aesthetic unity have held for minority cultures. He sees the vital relationship between how we think about God and beauty, and how that both shapes and is shaped by the kinds of experiences he had negotiating the significance of those two trees and all they meant for the communities that loved them. And so he develops a vision in which beauty is revealed through difference, of a God who created and therefore loves difference. He argues for the importance of foregrounding difference as a liberative act of imagination, liberated from the tyranny of the aesthetic norm which suppresses imagination. Garcia Rivera argues that it must be replaced with an imagination that, like Mary in her grand tapestry of praise, lifts up the lowly into the foreground, and in so doing with her whole being magnifies the Lord. And so he invites Christian artists and those who reflect theologically on Christian art to take seriously the responsibility we have to what he calls the difference makes. For someone with a degree in Western classical music, and I have one of my former classmates here tonight from Northwestern, go Cats. This liberating view of aesthetics awakens for me the ways in which the very normative tendencies that Garcia Rivera is trying to push up against can get so deeply ingrained in our traditions in a way that relativizes or even erases entire expressions which fall outside of it. Debates about what is authentically liturgical, beautiful, Catholic, all of these can become constrained by a theology that centers on a singular vision of what constitutes the beautiful. And even those of us whose identity is rooted in those oft-excluded expressions can internalize this kind of vision about what is authentically beautiful, leading even us to marginalize those expressions that are not at the heart of who we are. Indeed, Garcia Rivera offers a new angle of vision on the ways this plays out in the Catholic tradition. When conversations about aesthetics, especially in relationship to liturgy, begin and end with normative questions about what is appropriate for Christian worship, not only my family is the conversation often so profoundly uninteresting, but it often polices boundaries in ways that excludes many of the metaphorical Christmas trees of our familias and extended familias and the ways they reach toward heaven through them. And so for me, taking seriously the difference makes is one of the many things that finally inspired me to embrace the possibility of seeing the music I so loved as a privileged site of God's revelation, not only outside the sanctuary, but within it as well. And the more I have embraced difference, the more I have realized that the diversity of musical and other artistic expressions in the church's liturgy is not just about inclusion or welcome, though those are good things, but they are also about telling a fuller, more truthful story about who God is, a God who knows no native tongue, musical or otherwise. In fact, for me, embracing the richness and the beauty of the son cubano has not been about inserting something foreign into the liturgy of the church for fun or to make it a little more exciting, but has instead helped me see that it is in many ways even better suited to the ritual prayer of the church than many forms that dominate most Catholic hymnals. And this makes sense. This is music born out of places and with people with limited resources, centered not first on performance, but on engaging people on the street corner through simple, repetitive refrains. Come, listen, come, hear, come, sing with me. Indeed, the son to me often feels like the rhythm of a ritual, because it is, like our liturgy, deeply dialogical. There's that constant back and forth, right? Vamos a la casa del Señor. Vamos a la casa del Señor. And that repetitive nature, that constantly recurring short phrase that marks the son cubano, I think makes it particularly fitting even for people who do not know Spanish. It is indeed deeply communal music, music I can't sing for you, as I said at the beginning, but I need you to sing it with me. In fact, I love how that reality intersects with the commitment of doing theology en conjunto that marks many commitments of Latino scholars. A commitment to doing theology together, in conversation. And one of the most beautiful things about the Cuban son is that it is only something you can actually do en conjunto. Not coincidentally, the group that often accompanies people singing a son is called a conjunto. And so listening for the community of the beautiful, or in Garcia Rivera's repeated refrain, listening for what moves the human heart, and my own vocation as a composer of sacred music, has led me not to foreground difference merely for its own sake, but to see in that very difference ways of singing our lives to God as a church and to one another that have always been there. For me, writing, recording, and singing this music has been one step closer to singing that community into being in my own way. And so my deepest hope with this project is that by tending to my own particularity, I might invite others to do the same musically from their own perspective. And this to me is what a lot of good theology has the capacity to do for us. It's not about replacing old idols or norms with new ones. Now everybody needs to sing Cuban music all the time or write it. But about opening ourselves, each of us, you, Rufino, working in the music in your parish, all of us, to what is our unique particularity that we can bring out in our ministry in a range of beautiful forms, melodies, rhythms, and sounds. Arriba los corazones. Okay, this is a little trickier, but I feel like we have the AP crowd here with us tonight, so this sounds like this. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida. You gonna be okay? Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, of course you are. Let me sing that once more for you. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida. Try that. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. And this is like a real Latin American mashup, because this text is actually from Panama. I don't know if you know. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida. So this is like a Cuban went to Panama and came up with a song, okay? Let's try the whole refrain together. One. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Try it again. Arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Oh, and I got to teach you the verse. That response is this. Ven, Señor. Try that. Ven, Señor. And then, ven, Señor. You got it. Does anybody have a guiro? A ti acudimos sedientos, ven Señor, ven Señor. Tenemos fe en tu misterio. Queremos darte la vida con sus dolores y dichas. Arriba, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Otra vez, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Forgive our sins and our failings, then, Señor, we plead for mercy and healing. Then, Señor, our source of strength and compassion, you wash away our offenses. Then, arriba, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Arriba, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Que no haya luchas fraternas, ni esclavitud ni miserias. Aparte el odio del mundo, que exista un orden más justo. Arriba, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Arriba, arriba los corazones, vayamos todos al pan de vida, que es fuente de gloria eterna, de fortaleza y de alegría. Gracias, Rufino. Yeah, you did well. That was good. That was good. I could even start doing the montuno there at the end because you're really getting it. I have a feeling when I try these out in Minnesota, they might not go quite as swimmingly. Okay. So the second and more obviously influential work on this project is one shaped by and in conversation with the work of Garcia Rivera, and that's Caminemos con Jesús by Roberto Goizueta, the book from which the title of my project comes. And Goizueta also begins his work with a story, a kind of theological autobiography. And he notes that the fragments that he narrates are not merely precursory comments to the real theology that follows, but are instead themselves intrinsic to the work. And Goizueta tells of a life lived in between, his own exiled Cuban community, and for him, the predominantly Mexican-American community in the United States that shaped much of his theology. In a way that mirrors fragments of my own identity, he writes of being raised not in South Florida and its tightly knit Cuban community, but instead of being raised in Atlanta, where Latinos were then a minute minority. And he tells of the ways his family kept his Cuban identity alive across distance through food, songs, devotions, and the Spanish language. And like Garcia Rivera, Goizueta uses this personal experience to develop a theology of accompaniment, one that attempts to break down a range of binary barriers that so often define theology: church, academy, individual, communal, theory, practice, global, local, and more. In ways that anticipate many of the themes now present in the writings of Pope Francis, Goizueta develops a theology of accompaniment centered on walking with others, especially the poor and the powerless. And one of Goizueta's methods for doing this is foregrounding U.S. Hispanic popular religious practices. He is, of course, neither the first nor the last to do this, but he was the first to do it not by offering a general treatment of these practices, but instead by tending with care to specific practices at a specific place. For him, San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio. And among the practices that Goizueta foregrounds is the Semana Santa celebration at San Fernando. At the end of the Holy Thursday liturgy, he writes vividly of the procession that takes place as a litany is sung, to which people respond in song, Caminemos con Jesús. The people, he writes, are walking with Jesus to Gethsemane. It is again an experience that stirs all one's senses. The hundreds of flickering candles under a darkening sky, the loud horns of impatient drivers, turns out there were some Cubans there, the wide-eyed stares of curious onlookers, the angry insults of fundamentalist hecklers, and the incense-like fragrance of the smoke wafting from the multitude of candles, and always, caminemos con Jesús. What was remarkable reading that for me for the first time was not how other it was, but how familiar it felt to me. The materiality, the messiness, the ways in which the practices he describes exceed institutional boundaries, walls, and aesthetics, the blurring of the lines between lo cotidiano, everyday life, and the experience of more formal ecclesial practices. Through the prism of this and other expressions like them, Goizueta unfolds a theology of accompaniment that asks what these expressions might be speaking, singing, and embodying theologically. He sees in them deeply communal, embodied practices, and so he offers a vision of caminando con Jesús that is attentive to the cries of the least among us, that risks walking with the crucified Jesus in our midst in all of its messiness, all of its ambiguity, and so all of its beauty. That vision saturates my own Caminemos con Jesús. It is a project that attempts to respond to Goizueta's invitations, both explicit and implicit, to the U.S. Latino community to claim our heritage as a privileged site of God's revelation, and also of his invitation to an ongoing theology of accompaniment, grounded in a preferential option for the poor and the powerless. It probably says something about my personality that I always spend a lot of time early in a project, whether musical or academic, thinking about all the ways it can fail. And for me, there were two primary ways that this project could fail. One was musical. That is, if the music and the recording of it ended up being like some kind of caricatured imitation of Cuban music that one hears all the time on television and even among popular musicians that tries to emulate a so-called Latin style. But the other was theological, and it was for me equally as significant. We could get all the musical elements just right, but if the project was merely one in which we simply added nice words about God to a salsa beat and stirred, it would fail to live up to the fullness of a project that incarnated a vision of theology centered on seeking Christ in all the places he told us he would be found: the widow, the prisoner, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor, the powerless. To return to Garcia Rivera and to echo the Song of Mary, I wanted this project to be intimately bound to the ethical demands of lifting high the lowly. And so the phrase of that chant, which Goizueta recounts on that Holy Thursday evening at San Fernando, Caminemos con Jesús, is the theological thread woven throughout the entire project, as a summons to all the people, places, and moments in Scripture and in daily life in which we walk with Jesus and in which Jesus walks with us. Caminemos con Jesús. So you have four responses in the verse, all of which sound like this. Caminemos con Jesús. Try that. Caminemos con Jesús. Maybe for an alto. Caminemos con Jesús. Or a tenor. Little harmonies? No? You can do it. Here's the refrain. Caminemos con Jesús. Caminemos con su cruz. Try that. Caminemos con Jesús. Caminemos con su cruz. Caminemos el camino que él ilumina con su luz. Try that. Caminemos el camino que Él ilumina con su luz. Good job. As companions on the way, let us live the words we pray. Try that. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús. Como un pueblo crucificado, caminemos con Jesús. Con su cruz Él nos ha salvado. Como un cuerpo nos ha formado. Con Él hemos resucitado. Caminemos, caminemos con Jesús. Caminemos con su cruz. Caminemos el camino que Él ilumina con su luz. As companions on the way, let us live the words we pray. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús. In the borderland of Galilee, in the silent hours of Calvary, in the pain of His humanity, in the rising that has set us free. Caminemos con Jesús, caminemos con su cruz, caminemos el camino que Él ilumina con su luz. As companions on the way, let us live the words we pray. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús. A su imagen somos creados para amar como Él nos ha amado y anunciar a los abandonados la buena nueva que Él ha proclamado. Caminemos con Jesús, caminemos con su cruz, caminemos el camino que Él ilumina con su luz. As companions on the way, let us live the words we pray. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús. In broken bread we recognize your presence in the stranger's guise. With burning hearts and opened eyes, we walk with you we rise. Caminemos con Jesús, caminemos con su cruz, caminemos el camino que Él ilumina con su luz. As companions on the way, let us live the words we pray. With the ones the world has turned away, caminemos con Jesús, caminemos con Jesús. Caminemos con Jesús, caminemos con Jesús. So just one little postlude. which is going to be a spoken postlude. Whenever I have an opportunity to reflect upon the ways that my own cultural identities shape my own musical compositions, like I have this evening, I also think it's important to signal the limits of this kind of reflection, especially in this time of significant change in places like Atlanta, where I live, and places like here in Scranton. Much of Latino theology over the past several decades has focused on describing and celebrating the distinctiveness of Hispanic liturgical and devotional expressions against dominant cultural forces that have often ignored them. And on a pastoral level, that's really kind of important and even urgent and necessary in many communities, to ensuring that our communities feel seen and heard on every level of our parishes. But sometimes in the process of advocating for our communities, we can risk downplaying the internal diversity of our own communities and even of ourselves. In our affirmation of difference, we might pay attention to one kind of difference, but we risk neglecting many others. Too often, we reduce the complexities of culture to a shared language, region, or native country. But then we make invisible the diverse ways in which minority communities negotiate commonalities and differences, as well as the diverse ways in which different generations, even within the same family, right, relate to dominant cultures. And so I think some of the most important work we have yet to do, both in the academy and in the church, is to soften our boundaries about cultural identities, to avoid tendencies towards linguistic or racial essentialism, and instead make room for the complexity that each of us in our communities is. That's irreducible even to a song. Even my own early experiences testify to this kind of reality. The Cuban and American cultures I sometimes felt as distinct realities have always been deeply intertwined in me. And the two Christmas trees that Garcia Rivera wrote about often coexist alongside many other renditions of Christmas trees, visible and invisible, named and unnamed. The upstairs and downstairs of U.S. Catholicism can get at certain disparities, but we also need to be attentive to the ways in which all of us is more than merely one thing. In Caminemos con Jesus, the book, Goizueta writes that he initially saw his own vocation as that of building bridges between communities. But eventually he came to realize that he was the bridge. I am a bridge, he writes. This in-between life of ours is not something to be resolved or solved or transcended. It is instead something to be cherished and nurtured, for it is indeed the revelation of God. I have similarly come to see my own work in the academy, the church, and the world as attempting to be such a bridge. And my own Caminemos con Jesus unites the many threads of my own vocation in a singular way. I've come to see this project that I've shared with you tonight not merely as a practical response to those theologies, nor merely a tribute to my Cuban heritage, but as an expression of a theology all its own. And I've come to see that embracing the fullness of who we are in our work, whatever it is, has the potential to invite others to do the same. Thank you.
My heels come in handy now because it's tall. So thank you once again to Tony for his presentation. And now we have some time for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, comments they would like to ask, this is the time.
I would just like to thank you because the way that you have, what God has used you to bring that gift of music and theology to the church is awesome. I was blessed to be in North Carolina. We had people from all parts of the world, but it was through music that we came together. And it was this type of English and the sensitivity to the language
speech and combine your culture, exactly, to theological, to sing for God. Not just doing like regular music.
Yep.
But when you really combine.
Yeah, so Rufino's asking when I began to combine my musical world with my church world, and it actually happened at a very young age. In fact, there are videos that I hope are never seen that are locked away in my home of me singing at the Miss Minnesota pageant when I was a child. Yeah, oh no is right. And so like I was always doing a lot of singing like around the community, like, you know, different popular music and whatnot. But actually it was my fourth grade teacher, and I always say like so much about how we end up doing stuff in churches because someone asked us to do it, right? And my fourth grade teacher said, will you sing in this church choir I'm starting? And I'm from a very small town, right? So by this kids choir, there were 4 people in it, right? But I kind of fell in love with the idea of leading people in song. And in fact, I remember by high school, I was pretty much only singing church music. My mom's like, are you only gonna sing church music from now on? And she's pretty churchy, but she's like, yeah, I could use something else. But I felt very, very called to it. And then when I started hearing people do it in creative and interesting ways, I became just very intrigued by that. And my heart has pretty much always been, not only with, sacred music, but specifically liturgical music, which I think is its own thing, right? Because you can write music about God that's beautiful for choirs, big choirs, and I do some of that. But mainly my vocation, my ministry has been focused on el pueblo. Like, how do we get these people to sing? Not professionally trained singers. That's fun. I mean, right? It's fun. But for me, like, how do you write a song that's going to engage the people that are there on Sunday and all of their diversity? And that has just been like a driving passion for me. So early on, yeah, thank you for the question. And to your comment, sister, about bilingual music, I think writing bilingual music is really hard. Like, I say good bilingual music, because there's lots of bilingual music out there. I'm sure many of you have heard it. But like, how do we actually engage people? I mean, half the time when I'm singing in bilingual masses, my church does a lot of stuff bilingually. It's like, oh, we sing in English now, we're singing in Spanish now, what's happening? And so like, I've really been focused on what actually like engages a diverse assembly. And for me, it's kind of like a Spanglish, kind of like we've been doing tonight, where maybe the cantor sings some lanes in English, but the refrain stays the same in English or Spanish, and people can usually pick up repetitive phrases. I mean, the music of Tizé is a model for me for how that's done, but other call and response music too.
Beautiful song from that work, The Litany of Mary. It is so beautiful. It takes litanies of Mary, the titles of Mary from all of the Latin American countries. And it's a beautiful way to unite hearts and just, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean.
It's just a magnificent work.
Thank you. She's referring to a piece on this project that is, it's a litany of all of the titles of Mary, the Latin American mainly titles of Mary. I hope we didn't miss any. I was kind of worried about that. It has like 6 verses, and each verse has like 8 Marys mentioned. So it's a lot of Marys in the song. I can't sing it for you because there's no way I could remember all of the titles of Mary, but it's something like, I don't. You know, of course, it's so funny that you request that, because I was going to do that one instead of another one, but then I didn't bring it. I can't read the index, but it's like, ruega por nosotros, ruega por nosotros, ruega por nosotros, ruega por nosotros, ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte, amén, ahora de nuestra muerte, the muerte, amén. You know it? Yeah. Oh, you do it at your church? Nuestra Señora de la Caridad del Cobre, ruega por nosotros. Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, ruega por nosotros. You get. Oh, yeah. Nuestra Señora de Chinquinquirá, ruega por nosotros, 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 ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. Amén. Ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. Amén. Wow, had I known. Had I known that was such a big hit in Scranton, I would have would not have predicted that. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. On my music specifically, I'm sure it's impacted themes and images that I have picked up in my music writing. And it certainly liberated parts of my musical writing, for sure, in more, I would say, implicit ways. It's definitely, I always say so I work at Emory in Atlanta, which is a Methodist school, and I work at a United Methodist seminary. And it was the first time in my life when I went places and people would go, Tony, the Pope, because I was like the token Catholic. And so they associated me with the Pope, which had never happened to me in my life before. And then when I came, it was Benedict, and now it's Francis. And anyway, I won't say anything more about that, but people associated me with the Pope. But yeah, no, definitely his writing has been deeply influential on me, kind of as like a Catholic, I would say, which certainly informs my music. And I would say one thing that he has done also, he has a deep embrace of devotional expressions, but does so in a really beautiful way that connects it with the fullness of life, Christian life in the world, and doesn't see these things as like competing, like justice and devotion and all these things. So I think he's woven together a lot of things like a good Latino does. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a gift, and I especially this, I wish I would have brought the Litania, but I'm glad we got the impromptu version, okay? I promise next time I come to Scranton, I'll bring the music.